Hi everyone, my name is Enrico Ronchi and I'm an associate professor at Lund University, and today I'm going to talk about the evacuation of people with functional limitations, and this talk is about a research project that we have been conducting at Lund University, and I will present an overview of the main findings of the project, including research knowledge gaps and modeling implications. So this was a collaborative effort between the Department of Fire Safety Engineering and the Department of Health Science at Lund University. So there is a few people that I need to acknowledge. First of all, the project was sponsored by the Swedish Research Council for Sustainable Development, FORMAS, and this presentation is mostly based on the PhD project of Egress Enabler, that is a student I was a supervisor for. And also, I need to acknowledge Olivera Bukvich and Izet Norin that were helping with the literature review work of this project. So, as mentioned, this work was done within the Center for Aging and Supportive Environments at Lund University. So it was really a collective effort by a project team which includes different types of expertise linked to fire safety, but also psychology, occupational therapy, public health, and gerontology. So what we're going to see today is an overview of functional limitations and evacuation performance. So the main motivation of this work was that in the fire safety world, we talk a lot about people with disabilities, inclusive design, and so on. But when we look then and dig deeper into the type of information that we have available, we can see that we are quite behind compared to other fields in which those are very well assessed and investigated, like for instance the field of accessibility and health science. So what we're going to see here is the main outcomes of this project, which first performed 2 literature reviews aimed at assessing the state of the art of the domain of the relationship between functional limitations and evacuation performance. And we use here the terminology functional limitations because this can refer not only to people with permanent disabilities, but it can be also related to temporary limitations. And also we will see the different studies that were conducted in this project, including the study of the perspectives on egressibility through a qualitative study performed by doing semi-structured interviews with older people with functional limitations. And then we're going to see the Egress Enabler, that is a tool that has been developed with the goal of being able to measure aggressibility. So aggressibility here intended as accessibility to means of evacuation. And then we're going to see how this information can have implication in the evacuation modeling world. So what are the gaps that we have, and maybe what is the way forward towards a better representation of functional limitations and evacuation performance in models that we have nowadays. So why are we looking into this? Well, this is a very investigated topic in a way. So we know that prevalence of functional limitations is increasing in general because we have an aging population worldwide, which means that age is often associated with more and more severe functional limitations. And on the other hand, we also know that accessibility is increasing because we have several efforts, for instance, from the regulatory perspective, but also from the societal perspective, on increasing accessibility, so making sure that people with functional limitations can access more and more buildings. But this brings some issues when it comes to aggressibility, because we have more people with functional limitations, possibly also with more severe limitations, that are present in buildings, which means that we really need to investigate what are their opportunities when it comes to accessibility to means of evacuation. So not just entering a building, but also being able to leave a building in case of emergency, like for instance during a fire. So we here started from the premises of investigating different models of disability, and we know that there are different types of approaches in different fields on the way people look at disability and how this can be represented with models. So the historical way of looking into this was the so-called medical model, which says something like that impairments are seen as the problem, and so the main solution is are solutions that look into rehabilitation. So for instance, let's look at this example here of a person in a wheelchair that has to go through some staircases. Well, a medical model will say that the impairment is the problem itself, so the focus should be on rehabilitation. Then a social model will instead look at the way society deal with ensuring that people with disabilities will be able to participate in society. So it will look and say, okay, the stairs are the problem, so it's a problem of the environment. So here there should be a ramp, so we should make sure that any person, regardless of their functional abilities, should be able to use a given space. And where we are somehow in the middle with the so-called biopsychosocial model, which says the person has an impairment and has an issue in walking through the staircases, so we need a holistic approach to support their mobility. So we should look both into the personal component and also into the environmental component. And this kind of a middle approach is one of the key premises of the work that I'm presenting here. So what was done starting from this premise was to start looking into the literature review and see what kind of studies were available when looking into evacuation of people with functional limitations. And what we could find was that most of the studies were looking into a subset of functional limitations, and they will look at specific phases of the classic evacuation timeline. So what we thought was, okay, we should put together a categorization so that we are able to classify the different type of functional limitations within the evacuation timeline. But how do we do it? Because, you know, it's not sufficient to just talk in general about people with functional limitations or people with disabilities. We need to have a standard way to classify those limitations. So we look into the field of health science, and we found out that the WHO has a established classification of functional disability and health, so-called ICF, which is very much used in the domain of health science, but was at the time we did this project pretty much unknown in the world of fire safety. So we tried to combine these two words by looking at the evacuation timeline and looking into ICF, so how we could combine this standard categorization of functioning disability and health with the evacuation timeline. And what we produced was a coupling of the functioning according to ICF with the evacuation activities. So this was a very systematic work in which we looked into the main categories that we have in ICF, and we also look into the main studies that were available in this domain. We look systematically at the evacuation timeline, and then we produce a summary of the state of the art of research in this domain. So basically looking at the visual limitation, hearing limitation, mobility limitation, upper extremities limitation, cognitive limitations, and other. And one first aspect that we realized that there was a clear need for splitting mobility limitations from upper extremity limitations, because this can have a quite significantly different impact during evacuation, because one, they may relate to the ability of people to move in a given space. The other one will be mostly linked to the ability to negotiate certain egress components, like for instance a door and opening a door through a handle and so on. And this was also useful because it allowed us to identify not only the state of the art of research available and how this is linked to different phases of the evacuation timeline, but also research gaps. So I really recommend you to have a look into this paper that I mentioned here in Fire Technology, because if you want to have a comprehensive idea of the state of the art of research in this domain, this could be very useful. You have the link in here and in the paper. The second step, after doing this qualitative, systematic analysis of literature available in the domain of egressibility and in general on the domain of evacuation of people with functional limitations, we thought that it was needed to look into the perspectives of the target group that we were looking at, so the actual people with functional limitations. So what we did was to perform a qualitative study in which we wanted to investigate the subjective perspectives on aggressibility of older people that had functional limitations. So we kept in mind that perspective that I mentioned before, so to not just look only at the people, but also looking at the interaction between people and the environment, and look into strategies that could be used to mitigate the issues that are linked to functional limitations. So what we did was we looked into methods that are used in social science, so looking at semi-structured interviews for data collections. This was the method that we used, and also used the so-called reflexive thematic analysis for data analysis. So we did interviews with 28 participants with different type of functional limitations. It could be people that are blind, people that have issues linked to hearing, people with mobility limitations, a wheelchair, or people with upper extremity limitation, and so on. You can see here an image which provides a summary of the type of prevalence of the limitations in our sample. And also we look at all the participants, so age 61 to 88, because this is one of the age groups that is more prone to have actual functional limitation that may have an impact on an evacuation. And then we had, through this analysis, systematic analysis that is quite commonplace in the world of social science, we identified the key themes that were brought up by the participants that we interviewed. And this was very useful for us to have a perspective that is not merely the classic perspective that you will have when you look into experimental data, but also have an idea of how the target group was actually interpreting these problems. So I really recommend you to have a look into this paper published in Fire Safety Journal if you want to have more information about this study. And the main findings here was to identify key themes that were brought up by the people that we interviewed. And here I'm going to give you just an overall overview of the type of problems that were highlighted by the participants of our study. So the first thing that was very well mentioned by several people was that other people may have difficulties in understanding what are the limitations that people have, and also how to help. So here I just took some of the quotes and the main findings and themes and sub-themes that were popping up during the interviews, just to make you understand what are the key problems. So for instance, people with visible limitation are generally shown more consideration, but you know, not all disabilities or functional limitations are directly visible. So this means that there may be people that have possible functional limitations, but other people may not know it and may not notice it, and this brings potentially some issues during an evacuation. Also, people don't understand, may not be familiar with the type of limitations of people, and so even if they would like to help, maybe they do not know how. This was another issue that popped up in our interview study. And as I said, these are just two examples, key examples, but this makes you understand how useful could be this kind of studies because they look at the target population, not just at the classic analysis of experiments or data, quantitative data. Another issue that popped up was the strategies that people with functional limitations may use to cope with those limitations. So, for instance, a very common aspect that was arising there was that people may use the other senses. So if you have a limitation, for instance, in mobility, or if you have a limitation in vision, you may rely on other senses and so on. So a person blind may rely on the sense of touch, a person that has visual limitation may rely on hearing, and so on. So also people were claiming that in an emergency they will try to push through, but these may have, of course, some issues when it comes to the actual implementation of it, and also adjusting the behavior. So how people will adapt their type of behavior based on the conditions that they face. This was another very important aspect that popped up in the qualitative study. The other main theme that was identified was the uncertainty of evacuation, and this is kind of not surprising because people are not experiencing evacuation in their daily life, and maybe the only experience that they have may be an evacuation drill. Some of them may not even have an experience on an evacuation drill, and we know that depending on the countries and the regulatory framework you deal with, you may have in certain environments, compulsory or not compulsory evacuation drills. In some other, there may even be personal emergency evacuation plans in place, but not everywhere, which means that in any case a recurrent theme was uncertainty of evacuation. So people may not know how they will react in a situation of emergency, and they don't know how others will react, consider the fact that they have functional limitations. Another important thing that popped up is the people may be in general not so worried about this, which may in turn lead to an underestimation of the risk. And we know that this is a very recurrent issue when it comes, for instance, to fire evacuation. The people maybe tend to underestimate the consequences of a fire scenario, and the risk perception is not as it should be, because people tend to perceive processes as linear processes rather than an exponential process, like it may be when we deal with a fire, knowing that fire growth has an alpha t square function. So the idea here is that there is an uncertainty, and people do not know how both they will react and how others will react, considering the fact that they have a given functional limitation. So this was the first part of our study, which focused mostly on qualitative understanding of how people perceive evacuation when they have functional limitations. And this was immediately following up the literature review part of the work that we did. Then one of the main core of the work was actually developing a tool to be able to assess egressibility in public buildings. We mostly focused on public buildings at this stage because this was the first time we did an effort of this kind, and we wanted to focus on buildings that which we know they are actually meant to be accessible for everyone, given the accessibility, and also maybe they may not have necessarily always people available for assistance, because again, when we talk about evacuation of people with functional limitations, probably the first thing that coming to our mind is assisted evacuation. But if we look into the way the accessibility world look into the problem, it's actually to try to ensure participation of people, so to try to ensure that people are self-sufficient, which means that we should kind of put also a lot of focus when it comes to evacuation to self-evacuation possibilities, not just on assisted evacuation. So what we did as a first step was to develop an assessment instrument, which is made in a simple spreadsheet format for now, which is based on an existing tool in the world of accessibility that is called the Housing Enabler. This was a tool built in order to assess accessibility in housing environments, and has been tested for more than 20 years. So it means that we could actually mirror an existing successful approach that has been used in the world of accessibility. So the idea here is that accessibility is seen as a measurable entity, so we can mirror this approach when it comes to egressibility. So egressibility can be measured, and it can be tested for reliability and validity. So any instrument that we use to assess how egressible is a given space could be tested and see how valid it is. So as mentioned, we took as a starting point the Housing Enabler, and what the Housing Enabler do is, starting from this holistic approach, this biopsychosocial model that I was mentioning before, which is in between the medical model and the social model, which looks at the personal components, so what presence of functional limitations are there, so looking mostly at binary variables, so looking if a given functional limitation is available or not. So there's not like a fuzzy approach at this stage, but it's more like yes-no approach, so you have this limitation or you don't. And then you look into the environmental component, so are there any environmental barriers that may create a given issue to people with a given functional limitation. So you don't just look at the building per se, but you look how that feature of the building may be an issue for a given person. So that's the idea. So maybe a given configuration of a building might not be a problem for a certain group of people with a given functional limitation, while there may be a problem for someone else. So for instance, the type of alarm system you may have in place could be very important, depending, for instance, for people that have certain type of hearing impairments, while there might be other type of egress components and egress systems in a building that may be more important for other people. And if there are any barriers for a certain group of people, we need to cross-check those with the type of people that we deal with. So that's the idea. So the same building may be more or less egressible depending on what kind of people are in that building. So in this way we can produce actually an analysis which looks at the severity estimates from coexistence of given environmental barriers and functional limitations. So we can get actually numerical variables that we assign then to a given person and a given environmental barrier, and we see how they cross each other. So that's the idea. And again, when we look at the personal component, we made use of the main actual personal features that were listed in the housing enabler. So this is, again, taken directly from the world of accessibility. So we didn't reinvent this, but we use consolidated knowledge in the world of health science. And when it comes to the environmental component, we started with the analysis of the literature review that we did in the world of accessibility and evacuation. We did a categorization into subscales, but then we also had an expert panel which included experts both in the world of egressibility, so egress, and accessibility, to then try to identify a final pool of items which included both the general items and environmental barriers that you may have when it comes to accessibility, but there are also some specific aspects that are linked to evacuation, because we should not forget that when we deal with evacuation, there is one significant difference compared to when we deal with accessibility, that the time variable is very important. So it's not about if you can use, for instance, a door or not, but also how long it takes to use that door or to navigate a given egress component and so on. So the time variable was also inserted in there, and also other variables that are linked, for instance, to the crowding and other specific aspects of evacuation. So what we do then, we compute a score that look at the presence of a given environmental component. So if, for instance, I just put you an example here, if the evacuation path is free from obstructions and so on, yes, no, and then we have a severity score that for the different type of people that we saw before, so depending on what kind of issues they may have linked to hearing, mobility, visual, and so on, and they get a score which tells how much that given feature of the building may have an impact on a given type of person. So that's the idea. So to connect the environmental component with the personal component, and not using those in isolation but put them together. And again, this is apparently a very established methodology in the accessibility world, but has never been used in the world of egressibility. So that's why we thought it was very important to bring this knowledge, to have a multidisciplinary team. I have to say that myself and also my PhD student Eric, we learned a lot from our colleagues in the health science domain, because they had a lot of experience into dealing with this type of issues in the accessibility world. So what we learned from this, that there are certain gaps in research that are actually quite important to address, that still pose some limitations in the type of assessments that we can do. For instance, we know that when it comes to cognitive limitations, we have very little data available, and it's pretty obvious why, and it is because of ethical issues, because people that have cognitive limitations, they may not be able to give informed consent. So this is one of the issues that we have, that when it comes to those groups, it's much harder to make this assessment, because we do not know, we do not have so much knowledge and understanding and so much data. In a way, often those groups rely on assisted evacuation, but it is important that ideally we will have more data in this domain. Another thing that we thought that it was important, and we could not really find almost anything in terms of study, was the impact of smell. So with the aging, and it's very common that people may have a decrease in their ability to smell, and we could not really get hold of any whatsoever research on the ability of people to smell smoke and the decrease of those abilities with aging, and we thought that this could have a very important impact when we assess evacuation, especially when we look into the pre-evacuation phase. Then we looked into splitting upper and lower extremities. So as mentioned, most of the research we could find and the efforts that have been put in the past were mostly focused on lower mobility, so people on wheelchairs or people using devices to help them while walking, but we could not really find too many studies on upper extremities. There are some seminal studies done in the 90s, University of Ulster, but not too much more apart from that. And also, as mentioned also earlier, the temporal dimension is very important, because most of the studies in the domain of accessibility, they care about if something can be done or not, but not how long it takes. And this is quite of a very different issue if we look into this in the world of evacuation. So what we want to argue here in this project is that we need to change completely the way we look into aggressibility in the world of fire safety engineering. We need to make use of research in the health science domain. There is a lot going on in the world of accessibility and health science that needs to be brought in the world of fire safety engineering, and this is just the start with this project. We need to hope that this is a foundation for a new stream of research, because this is really important. Honestly, when we look at RSET, ASET, we already know that one of the main drivers of RSET, if we look at self-evacuation scenarios, is actually those proportion of people that may have functional limitations. So it's really the driver of our results very often. So we really need to focus and hopefully have a new stream of research in this domain. We need more empirical studies on functional limitations versus evacuation, but we should not forget that those should be of different kinds. So as I said, in these studies we started with qualitative analysis and with assessment instruments, and we hope that these are complemented with more and more quantitative studies. I know that there are several efforts going on in the literature with a very recent work that will be implemented in the SFP handbook, I know, so a very nice compilation of the data and experiments in there. But again, we need to have more data especially to calibrate our models. And again, the main logic and the main reasoning of our work is that we should start from a starting point of equal rights to safety. So we cannot have a starting point of a non-inclusive design. So when it comes to evacuation modeling implications, at the moment we have a very limited resolution in what is the personal component. So most models that are out there, they risk to tend to oversimplify functional limitations, and most of the efforts are available nowadays on mobility limitation. And as I said, it's not a criticism for model developers, because the models are as good as the data that we have, and since most of the data have been collected for mobility limitations, that's what the models are nowadays mostly capable of doing it. But we need to acknowledge that we risk to oversimplify functional limitation. There is much more than just lower mobility limitations. Then there are issues with lack of data. We know that it's hard to model certain type of limitation because we have very limited empirical research available. As mentioned, cognitive limitation, smell, speech, hearing limitation, visual limitation, or upper extremity. So this is something that we need to know and maybe consider safety factors for the fact that we know that there are limitations in there. When it comes to model developments, we would like to have more interaction between occupant profiles and environment. So the idea is that my hope as a long-term vision of evacuation models is that we will start doing what they're doing in accessibility. So not just looking at the persons per se or the environment per se, but start looking into how these two components interact with each other. So ideally we will have an agent with certain feature and an environment with certain barriers, and see how the barrier interact with the personal component. As mentioned, we have now mostly a static environment. I mean, there are some features that might be dynamic, but we hope that in the future the environments, the way they are represented in evacuation model, may become more dynamic, so that we could have some sort of signals that the environment can send to a given agent, and we have more detailed interactions between the persons and environment. And also the calibration, given the fact that we have absence of data and explicit modeling features, we need to have flexible models for case-to-case input calibrations. And as I said, there are some models that I know that put model developers that put a lot of efforts in this, but we should not forget it. So we should not forget that there are many different groups that might have very specific type of limitations, and depending on the type of environment you are studying, it's important to assess how to consider those groups, given the fact that we don't have too much data for the calibration. So that's it. I hope this was an interesting presentation for you to give an overview of the project. Of course, I put some references and literature linked to it, so I hope that if you have more interest in this topic, you can look up and study this topic even more. So thank you.
Hi, Enrico. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering, you said you got a score system to assess building accessibility, right? And I was wondering, how do you normalize the results for different buildings? Like there are two buildings with different size, but have the similar components. Will they get the same score?
Well, the concept here is, first of all, the tool for now, it's designed only for public buildings. So we have to start from somewhere, and we restricted the number of buildings that we deal with mostly to public. So no homes, no residential, because those, they present completely different features than public buildings. The way the Egress Enabler works is that you have to make an assessment of each of the components that you have in the building, but then those are weighted. So then you get basically a total score for each of these kind of components. So for instance, you get a total score for all the staircases in a building, and you weight different staircases depending on the importance that they have in the evacuation strategy. So for instance, if you have two buildings, one with only one staircase and one with 10 staircases, then the one that has 10 staircases will have to get a weight for each of the staircase or each of the typology of staircase, and then being weighted together. And this allows us to compare different buildings even when they have pretty different sizes or pretty different characteristics. And this applies with everything, and not just with staircases, it applies with every evacuation component that we take into consideration. So this goes also with the type of alarms and type of doors and so on. So there is a weighting system inbuilt in the Egress Enabler that allows you to be able, so basically the score that you get will tell you how much you can improve in that building when it comes to ingressibility. And then it will also tell you a final star rating, like a hotel, let's say. So you get a 3-star building, a 2-star building, and then you know from the aggressibility standpoint, okay, that building, yeah, it's not so good, or that building, okay, it's a 5-star building from the aggressibility standpoint. So that's the idea.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
There was another question about, are there any considerations for mental health or mental illness?
Well, the cognitive, everything that has to do with cognitive limitations, it's a very sensitive and difficult territory because we have very little data available. One important point that I want to highlight is that this tool is meant for buildings that rely on self-evacuation, not on assisted evacuation. So I would expect that in many buildings, when there are, let's say, people with issues that are linked more to cognitive, to the cognitive aspects, may have assisted evacuation as a strategy. But from as it is now, it's probably one of the weakest points, not just of our tool, but of any tool that we have available nowadays, including simulators, including any fire engineering tools, because we don't have data, or we have very little data that tell us, okay, taking into consideration like people that have different type of cognitive or different type of issues linked to that, how do we factor this in a building where we have self-evacuation possibilities, because that's what we are looking at here.
Great, thank you. Other questions in the room? No? Here, Steve, Kyle. Okay.
Hello, Enrico. It's Steve here. Fantastic presentation. This is a hard question, right? So I'm putting you on the spot. You mentioned the 5-star, 4-star review, which I think is actually a really cool idea. But isn't the problem more fundamental in a sense, like we calculate access or design for access and we mandate for access, and then we sort of get into egress a bit later down the timeline of a design? Actually, shouldn't the starring system be right up front and say the concept, I'm talking about future buildings, obviously, but the concept of your future building has to have access and egress connected together. Otherwise, you're just putting people in trouble, potentially further down the line. So you need a more integrated approach. And that's, by the way, for everyone, not just for people with supposed issues or impairments. I just wondered if you could comment on that.
I think this is a very good point, Stephen. Thanks for your question. And it's a bit going into this paradox that the more accessibility we have, the more potential issues we possibly have with egress, because we have more people that potentially have functional limitations. And this, though, has to come more from a regulatory standpoint. And I know that there have already been talks, for instance, in some accessibility committees. I had a chat recently with one of the members of one of the EU documentation for and regulatory information about accessibility to insert egress as part of the accessibility analysis that is mandated for buildings. But this has to come from the standpoint of a regulatory mandatory requirement before, like at which stage of the process to come before we can do too much nowadays, because we all know, I mean, I guess you have many fire engineers in the room, we all know the fire, it seems like the little strange brother that architects have to deal with afterwards, and they complain about it. And we that we work in this domain, we struggle to fight for the importance of fire safety. So I think this has to come into the big picture of regulatory decisions. And also now we know that with all the modern tools, I mean, we've seen it the other day with the presentation from Nazim, with all these big BIM packages that put everything in. I mean, in theory, down the line, we could be able to do all these things integrated. So one of the visions that I have for this tool that we've been working in is that it could be possibly integrated down the line into a BIM tool. So not just a spreadsheet that is a standalone tool, but having something that is up and running within Revit and that the architects can directly use along with the, let's say, design analysis that they will do at the beginning of their design stage of the building. But this is a very good point.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting option in the future, you know, an opportunity there for those tools to help score these things and categorize this all easily. So with that, thank you very much, Enrico. Good to see you.
Thanks, Brian.
And
thanks, everyone.
See you later.